Let me know when I show up.
Yep.
All right. What's up, guys, and welcome to One Take. I'm Gil. My brother Alon is off screen.
Hello.
He's my tech guy. And right now, we're going to do something kind of like I don't really watch sports, so you can tell me, Alon, if this is a proper analogy, but this is like a pregame for the new episode of Watchmen tonight.
Yeah, I don't really watch sports either, but that sounds right.
All right. Well, I believe that before major sporting events, they have a pregame show where they kind of hype up the game, and that's what we're going to do for tonight's episode 4 of Watchmen. Right now, for those of you who need a reminder of what happened last week, this will be a recap of episode 3. We'll do some theories, predictions for what we might see tonight in episode 4. Then, at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, when episode 4 drops, the stream shuts off. We watch the new episode. Then at 10:30, we get back on the live stream and do a quick reaction into episode 4. With that, let's jump into episode 3, last week's episode. So the episode opens up with a character that we hadn't yet seen in this show, named Lori. We pretty quickly learn that this is a character that you'd be familiar with if you read the graphic novel, and that's Silk Spectre. So she apparently works for the FBI now, and anyway, the episode begins with her in a blue phone booth. Eventually, we learn that this phone booth allows people to leave messages that get transmitted to Mars in the hopes that Dr. Manhattan will hear them, kind of like prayers. And I keep looking over here at my brother because you've never watched this show, right?
No.
And he had a chance to catch up. He didn't, so now it's all going to get spoiled for him.
It's okay.
Yeah, so this is basically a recap for you, and it's also me catching him up so he can watch episode 4 with me tonight. So Lori's in this blue phone booth, and one thing to remember is that Lori had a relationship with Dr. Manhattan back in the day. So right now, she's calling up her ex-lover. So she calls him to tell him a joke, essentially. And she starts to tell a type of joke that you've probably heard before, where the exact details of it don't matter, but at a certain point in the joke, somebody throws a brick or a rock, in this case a brick, as high in the air as they can. Then she forgets what joke she's telling. She says, I can't remember the rest of that joke, and says, let me tell you a different joke instead. Essentially, the joke goes that 3 superheroes have recently died. They're at the pearly gates. They're trying to make their case to God that they should go to heaven. These heroes aren't mentioned by name, but based on the details Lori gives us, we know that these heroes are Night Owl, Ozymandias, and Dr. Manhattan himself. Each of those heroes make their case, and in every single instance, God asks them, how many people did you kill? Night Owl says, I've never killed anybody. God says, you're much too soft, snaps his fingers, sends him to hell. Ozymandias, as we all know, killed millions. And he cops to it, but he says, I killed millions to save the world. God sends him to hell. Dr. Manhattan, looking kind of sad, he knows the future, so he knows no matter what he says, he's going to hell. And throughout the episode, we cut back to this framing device, to this phone booth, and we get little snippets of this joke. So I'll pause there in the middle of Lori's joke, and at the end of the recap, we'll return to the phone booth, which is where the episode ends. Any questions so far, Alan? This all makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
I know some of those names.
Perfect. So from the phone booth, Lori goes to a bank, pulls out a gun to hold up the bank, which is shocking because Lori, we think she's a good guy. And then a very Batman-like hero named Mr. Shadow shows up. And it turns out that this whole bank robbery was a sting operation. Turns out that Lori, the ex-Silk Spectre, is part of the anti-vigilante task force in the FBI. So to catch heroes, they set up these fake bank robberies, fake crimes. Hero shows up. Lori shoots him in the back several times. After she shoots him, somebody asks, because Mr. Shadow thankfully survived, somebody asks Lori, how did you know his armor would stop the bullets? Lori doesn't answer, implying that she didn't know they were going to stop the bullets. Lori is so cold-blooded, she hates heroes so much, she was willing to kill the guy. Somebody yells at her, why are you arresting him? He's a hero. And now I'm going to have to curse now, but I'm quoting Lori, so it's okay. She turns to the guy and says, he's not a hero, he's a fucking joke. So the first couple of episodes that we watched, part of me was wondering, where are all the masked vigilantes? Because really the only masked people that we saw were the 7th Cavalry, the people running around in Rorschach masks, and the cops in Tulsa who now wear masks, plus Lady Knight, who wears a mask, but she works with the cops, so that doesn't really count. I found myself wondering, are there any masked heroes around? And it turns out there are. Maybe just there aren't as many in Tulsa. And that's another thing to point out. The last 2 episodes have been fully taking place in Tulsa. This is the first time we've gotten out of Tulsa and we're seeing some other people. This also establishes where Laurie's at these days. And this is one of the first times where we very clearly revisit someone from the graphic novel and get an idea of where they're at. And where she's at is she's very cynical. She apparently hates heroes now and is very hardened by whatever's happened to her over the last few decades. I also love the concept of making fake crimes to catch vigilantes. It's one of those cool world-building elements. And that's one of the things this show has done the best out of any show I've seen, which is, especially if you're not someone who's read the graphic novel, you're entering this entire alternate history, this show has done virtually no exposition. It just hands out these parcels of information about this world totally organically. The other thing I'll point out about this scene is it's kind of ironic that they sort of treat Batman like garbage here. Right, Mr. Shadow very clearly is meant to essentially be Batman, and they show us what would happen to Batman in this world. He'd get taken out like a chump. And it's kind of ironic because in the comic book world today, for those of you who only watch Watchmen but don't read comics, as we speak, Batman is crossing over into the Watchmen universe, and I'll tell you, he's doing just fine. So the writers of the comic are apparently not on the same page. No pun intended, comic book. Nice. They're not on the same page as the writers of this show. And by the way, Alon, I've got my notes up here to do my recaps. I'm not looking at the chat. So if anybody is saying anything in there, you
sure,
got Adam, Drew.
Adam says that's cold, and Drew says super cold.
I assume that is in reference to shooting Batman in the back, and I agree. So one other question before I leave this scene is, are there any successful heroes out there? So far we've seen one, and he was basically crap. The only other successful people in masks that we've seen are the 7th Cavalry to some degree, and the cops. So I'm curious if there's anybody out there that's actually fighting crime successfully. From there, we go to Laurie's apartment. We see her feed a pet owl. And then she takes out a mysterious suitcase, a metallic suitcase. She opens it, but before she can take the contents of that suitcase out or do anything with it, she's interrupted by a knock at the door. And Alon, I want you to remember that suitcase, because later in the episode, we're going to reveal what's in that suitcase, and it's shocking.
Okay.
All right. So Senator Kean shows up, and he tells Laurie that she needs to go to Tulsa to investigate the chief of police, Judd's death. And here we learn a little bit more about the world. So we know that in Tulsa, cops wear masks. And I found myself wondering the last couple of episodes, is that only in Tulsa? Is that across America? Here we learn that it is only in Tulsa. There is an act called DOPA, the Defense of Police Act, and apparently since enacting it, crime has been down by 80%. So why was Judd killed? Senator Kean's theory is maybe it's mask envy. People are jealous and they're not happy about the fact that cops are wearing masks, and Judd, I almost said Judd Apatow, but Police Chief Judd is one of the people that was a proponent of putting masks on police, so maybe they wanted to kill him. It also comes out in this conversation that Senator Kean wants to become president, and he gently reminds Laurie that presidents can pardon. Perhaps if Senator Kean became president, he could even get your owl out of that cage. So a few interesting things we learned here. Number one, that is likely, pretty much definitely a reference to Night Owl, one of the heroes we watched in the Watchmen graphic novel, somebody that Laurie also had a relationship with. So where's Night Owl? Apparently he's in prison. That also explains how some of his tech has gotten out there. In episode 1, we saw cops flying around in the Night Owl's ship. And in the last episode, we saw Lady Night using his night vision goggles. So it looks like Night Owl was put in prison, and the cops have probably appropriated his technology. I also love how this episode, I've already mentioned this, is starting to embrace some of the past characters more than the previous 2 episodes, and I kind of respect this show for taking its time getting to that. It would have been very easy to just dole out old characters that we know and love from the graphic novel, but they invented this whole new cast of characters, and it took their time until they could organically introduce characters like Silk Spectre and at least mentioning characters like Night Owl. Also, interestingly enough, we're learning a little bit more about what's going on in Tulsa, and the way they're doing that is by taking us out of Tulsa. So we have some outsiders, people that will discuss Tulsa, people like Laurie who are going to go there, and that kind of becomes a conduit for us as an audience to learn more about the state of things there and what we're dealing with there. Senator Kean, I'll say too, is kind of an interesting character. I feel like he's hiding something. Especially, we know that there's likely a conspiracy going on in Tulsa. If there's a conspiracy happening there, then this Senator Kean is likely to be in on it. And I have a little bit more to say about that in a later scene, so we'll get to that. From there, we go to the FBI headquarters, and someone there is giving a briefing, essentially, on Judd's death. They explain the 7th Cavalry, who they are, and as they're flipping through slides, one image of Rorschach's journal pops up. And it turns out this guy named Petey, one of the folks working there at the FBI, slipped that image in there, which really pissed off the guy who was giving this presentation. He essentially says, "Is it the 80s? No. Then why do we give a crap about Rorschach?" Petey defends himself, saying that he thinks it would be helpful to get some psychological context around Rorschach, so perhaps we can better understand what the 7th Cavalry are all about. From there, we go to a private jet where Laurie and Petey are flying to Tulsa. And interestingly enough, Laurie handpicked Petey to come with her. She wanted to go alone. She was forced to take someone. She decided to bring him. While they're in flight, Petey, you can tell, is basically a fanboy. He puts on a mask. Laurie says, "What the hell is that?" And Petey explains that in Tulsa, cops and detectives wear masks, so why can't Petey wear a mask? And it sort of comes out, like I said, that he's a fanboy, and then defends himself saying, "Don't call me a fan, all right? I have a PhD, I'm a historian," and essentially he knows all about the Watchmen. He asks Laurie about Veidt. He says he's not a fan, but clearly there's an aspect of that there. It was kind of funny watching him defend himself, because it sort of felt like he could be a fan of the Watchmen comic, and someone says to him, "Oh, you're a fanboy for this comic book," and he defends himself saying, "Hey, this is a work of art," or in the context of the show, "This is real history." One detail I'll point out in this scene is that as they're flying, as they approach Tulsa, they see an interesting structure in the distance, which they explain is the Millennium Clock, something built by a person named Lady True, who I believe we're going to meet for the first time in episode 4 tonight. And Lady True, she said when she put up that Millennium Clock, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." Essentially, Lady True purchased Adrian Veidt's company and sort of quoted him. That was a quote from Adrian Veidt after she took over that company. We also learned through conversation between Laurie and Petey that Veidt has officially been declared dead. We learned that he's been missing for a while. No one's found him. No one knows what's going on with him, but the world believes him to be dead, which astute viewers will know that that's already been established because somebody was reading a newspaper in episode 1 where that was essentially the headline. Now, this is interesting to see because there is a character who has not yet been named. This old man who lives in a bizarre castle. We've seen him in the first 2 episodes. Everyone watching, me included, suspects that that's Adrian Veidt, and later in the episode that will be confirmed. From there, we see Laurie go to different spots, try to investigate what's going on. When she goes to the crime scene where Judd was hung, she spots some wheelchair tracks. Then we see her go to Judd's house. Later on, we'll learn that while she was there, she found the secret compartment in his closet. And all she found there was basically a mannequin because it looks like Lady Knight stole the KKK outfit that was there before. From there, Laurie heads to the warehouse that the cops here in Tulsa use for interrogations, and she decides to speak to Looking Glass. He's the character who wears that very cool Rorschach-esque mask, the reflective mask, and we learn a little bit more about the pod that he brings people into for interrogations. And I was hoping we'd see this pod again because that was one of the more interesting visual elements of this show. And while in the pod, Laurie questions Looking Glass a little bit, wants to understand what this pod is all about, and he explains that it determines and exposes negative cultural biases to which a suspect might otherwise not admit. And as Laurie is one to do, she immediately undercuts that by saying, "So it's a racist detector." And she's not exactly wrong, it sounds like. Throughout the conversation, Looking Glass kind of gets rattled at what seems like a lack of respect for Judd from Laurie. She speaks pretty callously about him. And while Looking Glass is looking upset and a little bit rattled, he explains that Lady Knight is not around because she took a personal day to work on the chief's Alun. Question: what is it called when you go to a funeral and you say something nice?
Eulogy.
A eulogy. She's taking a day off to write a eulogy for Judd's funeral. Pretty interesting to see Looking Glass get emotional here. He's somebody who I want to get to know more about. Part of that's just because of how cool he looks and how cool his mask is, but it's also the fact that he's been so calm and collected, so closed off. Like I said before, he sort of feels like this show's Rorschach. So it's pretty interesting, like I said, to see him get rattled and get a little bit emotional. I hope that tonight and in the rest of the season we get to know more about him. From there, Laurie and Petey check into the Black Freighter Inn. And right here, by the way, we get a reference to, if you read the original graphic novel, one of the interesting little aspects of the world of Watchmen is that in this world, superheroes actually exist. So when people read comic books for an escape from reality, do they want to read about superheroes? Turns out no, they want to read about pirates. And the most famous pirate comic book, and the one that we saw pieces of in the original graphic novel, was Black Freighter. So it looks like someone's decided to open up an inn and name it after that comic book. At the funeral, Laura wants to talk to Angela or Lady Knight. And as Angela's giving her eulogy, a 7th Cavalry member shows up wearing a suicide vest. He takes Senator Kean hostage and explains that the suicide vest is hooked up to his heart, and if his heart stops, that vest will explode. Laurie, the Silk Spectre, doesn't believe him, so she immediately takes out a pistol and shoots him in the head. And then that suicide vest starts to beep faster and faster, so it looks like he wasn't lying. The thing's about to explode. Angela springs into action. She takes this guy with the suicide vest, pushes him into the hole that they're about to put Judd in, and then throws Judd's casket over him. She runs away, the bomb goes off, and she's saved the day. This was an extremely tense scene, and one of the things that made it work really well is the score that they use. One of the best things this show is doing is the score. I've mentioned it before. They bring in these sort of synth sound effects, and one of the motifs they keep going back to is the sound of a ticking clock. And during this scene, that ticking clock sound comes back, so you know something bad's about to happen. I'll also say that I found it kind of, at first, unbelievable. If this 7th Cavalry member has that suicide vest hooked up to his heart, and his heart stops, why wouldn't the vest explode right away? It felt a little bit silly that Angela had a good 10 to 15 seconds to spring into action and cover up the bomb so it doesn't kill anybody. But then I gave it some more thought, and it occurred to me. If you had a suicide vest hooked up to a device that says if your heart rate stops that the thing should explode, you really don't want that thing to mess up. So you probably would have some delay there, so if there's a blip where the device malfunctions and it thinks your heart stopped but didn't, you don't want it to blow up. You probably want to give it a good 10 to 15 seconds. So the scene ultimately worked for me. I also thought it was interesting to see a 7th Cavalry member using this tactic. We haven't seen them do anything so far that would tell us they're so quickly willing to die for this cause, which makes me suspect that perhaps this member did not expect to die at all. Alon, I see you moving the mic to your mouth. What's going on over there?
Drew says, gotta make sure he's dead, man.
Got to make sure the guy that exploded is dead? I mean, if that's who you're talking about, he's definitely dead because I think we saw body parts fly. But if that's not who you're talking about, just clarify and we'll return to that comment. But I found it, like I said, I found it interesting that one of these cavalry members would be willing to put a suicide vest on, and I suspect that he walked into that situation pretty certain that he wasn't going to die. Earmark that comment. I'm going to come back to it in about 2 minutes.
Yeah, with the delay on the bomb.
There's a delay on the bomb. Yeah, no, exactly. Actually, yeah, okay. I think we're agreeing with each other here. Exactly. If that heart rate monitor stops for a second, you don't want that to be some kind of malfunction. You want to make sure this guy is 100% dead before the bomb goes off. So you and I are on the same page here. So later in the night, Senator Kean is being interviewed, and a little detail there is that he still has blood on his shirt from the 7th Cavalry member who got shot in the head. If I were a senator, I'd probably change my shirt or do something, and that adds to the kind of, there's something a little bit off about this guy nature. One interesting thing, too, is while he's giving the interview to the cops or giving the interview to the press, someone shouts out, do you have any comment about the rumor that Russians are trying to build an intrinsic field generator? He goes past that comment pretty quickly, but the intrinsic field generator is what a guy named John was working on when the generator got messed up and he turned into Dr. Manhattan. So it sounds like there are rumors that the Russians are trying to make their own Dr. Manhattan. Now, I don't think that anything's really going to come of that, but just an interesting little detail. So I mentioned earlier that I suspect the 7th Cavalry member went into that situation with that suicide vest, knowing pretty certainly that he was not going to die. And what I think is that Senator Kean was somehow in on this situation. I believe maybe he orchestrated the events that we saw at that funeral. Perhaps his plan was to be kidnapped by that 7th Cavalry member. When they left the scene, maybe they would stage somehow an escape by Senator Kean. He comes out looking like a hero. But 7th Cavalry member gets shot in the head. Senator Kean rolls with it. He still gets to look like a hero. He stayed calm and collected the whole time. But that's my theory.
Drew says, exactly. Alon was just slow on the comment.
There also is like a 25-second delay. So Alon's a little slow. The internet's a little slow. Plenty of blame to go around to everyone except for me, it seems like.
Well, you could keep the chat window up on your end there.
Yeah, it's true. It's true, but I'm not going to. Then we get a very interesting scene where Angela and Lori meet and have sort of an interrogation. So it's always interesting to see two really strong characters, two immovable objects collide, and that's exactly what we see here. Essentially, Laurie tries to rattle Angela. She tries to take on the dominant role in this conversation. She tells Angela, I saw wheelchair tracks at the crime scene. I saw a compartment in Judd's closet, and she suspects that somebody close to Judd knew there was something in that closet, went and took it away, so after Judd's death, nobody could find it. And she's partially right. We didn't see it happen, but we know that Angela found the KKK outfit in Judd's closet, so it's a safe bet she got rid of it. So after this whole thing of Laurie basically telling Angela, look, I've been here for 10 minutes, and I already figured all this crap out, Angela's not intimidated. After all that, there's a little bit of a silence, and Angela essentially says, ooh, and then pours her coffee out. So she's not going to be intimidated. So a couple other things here. Okay, I mentioned a lot of this already. Two really strong characters colliding was as interesting to see as you'd hope. I like the idea. We talked about how the Russians may be trying to develop their own Dr. Manhattan. I think that's really just a fun element in the background. I don't think anything's going to happen there, but hey, maybe that could be a season 2 or a season 3. Then we go back to the Black Freighter Inn and Alun. Remember, yes. I mentioned that suitcase before.
Right.
So Laurie takes out the metal suitcase. She pops it open, and inside we find a big blue phallic, it's a sex toy. You know what I'm talking about?
Whoa.
And inside the suitcase, we see a picture of Laurie and Dr. Manhattan on the cover of Esquire magazine, and it says Silk Spectre takes Manhattan, which is clearly sexual innuendo.
Yes.
So you know that Laurie and Dr. Manhattan used to be in a relationship, and we've seen her this entire episode be very cool, collected. She doesn't seem to have any hero worship. She seems to hate superheroes. This is the first time where we see a little bit of a crack in that. Then we see her leave her room. She knocks on Petey's door, and she sleeps with him. So a couple of thoughts about this. So I think the way we're supposed to read this is that I think that Laurie is struggling more than she lets on. And I think that here, between the object in her suitcase, yes, and Petey, I think she's using sex like a drug to sort of keep it all together. And when she's with Petey, we see on his desk a copy of Rorschach's journal. So one thing that I'm kind of looking forward to in some ways and kind of a little bit concerned about in other ways is Petey, like we said, is a character with who has a deep reverence for the history of this world. He's been used a little bit for exposition in this episode. He helped establish the fact that Laurie and Veidt knew each other from back in the day, and I have a feeling he's going to be used as an exposition device going forward in this show. I just hope that they're careful about it because, like I've said, they've done such a good job doling out the exposition organically so far. There's some risk here, so I hope that they're careful about it. Then we get to one of the parts of each of these episodes that I think whenever you start a new episode of Watchmen, part of you's waiting for. We want to get back to Adrian Veidt, and we want to figure out what the hell is going on with this guy. So we see the old man once again doing something that we don't quite understand, but he seems to be putting some kind of a suit together. He's stitching stuff up, and he takes a helmet off of a suit of armor, and then he gets one of his Mr. Phillips clones, puts him in that suit, and he tells him, "This is going to be the one. I feel it in my bones." Mr. Phillips says, "I never doubted you, master." And Adrian says to him, "That, Mr. Phillips, is because you are incapable of doubt." He asks him, "Are you ready to venture into the great beyond?" Then he ties Mr. Phillips, who's in this suit that he's created, ties him to a rope, starts to unscrew a tank, and you hear it feeding something into that suit. I suspect it's oxygen. Cut to Phillips in that suit lying on the ground, dead and frozen. Veidt gets pissed off. Apparently, whatever he was trying to accomplish there was unsuccessful. And he says, I think we're going to need a thicker skin. So the theory is that whatever he made that suit out of wasn't strong enough to withstand whatever he did with that suit. Gets on his horse and rides away. And by the way, as he rides on that horse, we see a little pirate flag. So another reference to the pirate motif in this world. I'll also say that if you go back and watch this scene, it has some very strange music behind it, which does a great job of just adding to the otherworldly feel of this whole Adrian Veidt situation. He approaches a herd of buffalo, takes out a bow, shoots one, and kills it. Immediately, a man on a horse in the distance shows up, wearing a mask, takes out a gun, and shoots at Adrian Veidt's legs. Cut 2. Adrian Veidt sitting in a room, meditating in a very similar pose that we've seen Dr. Manhattan in before. Crookshanks and Mr. Phillips show up with a cake. Interesting detail about this cake. We saw the cake in episode 1. It had 1 candle, and they said, we're celebrating your anniversary. Episode 2, they show up with 2 candles. In this episode, they show up with 3 candles. We'll come back to that in a moment. Crookshanks explains that Veidt has received a letter from the game warden, presumably the guy that we saw on the horse in the mask. The letter essentially says, you violated the terms of your captivity, don't let it happen again, and by the way, thank you for the tomatoes. Veidt has Crookshanks get to a typewriter and type up a letter for him. He says that he feels very bad about this, but I can't believe you're accusing me about this. As if I were a dastardly forest brigand, or worse, some sort of Republic serial villain, which is a reference to the graphic novel, where at the end of the graphic novel, when Adrian Veidt explains his whole plan, in most comic books you read, when the villain explains their plan, you have a chance to stop them. But he basically says, I'm not some Republic serial villain. You can't stop the plan because it's already happened. As Veidt tells Crookshanks this letter to write, it almost has a playful tone. For example, when he gets to the end of the letter and says, I did not violate any of these terms, how dare you accuse me, and if you want to, you can show up and accuse me to my face. And then he says, that said, I'm pleased you enjoyed the tomatoes. The music over this scene is also sort of playful, so I have a feeling that the relationship between the game warden and Veidt, like I've said a few times, is kind of playful in nature. And by the way, at the end of the letter, he says, signed, Adrian Veidt. So that's the first time in the series where it is confirmed that yes, this character is, in fact, Adrian Veidt, also known as Ozymandias. He then says, I hunt again at midnight. He suits up and dresses in the classic Ozymandias outfit that we know and love from the original Watchmen graphic novel. So I'm still finding this whole Adrian Veidt situation very intriguing. I did complain previously that this is my least favorite type of mystery. It's the type of mystery where it's only mysterious because they're only showing us certain things. It's not like we have a character who's trying to figure something out and they're going and finding the clues in organic ways. All that's happening is they're showing us only clips of what's going on, so it's all very confusing. But it's all being done with so much artistry. The acting is so great, the music is amazing, the cinematography is great. When Watchmen cuts to Adrian Veidt, the quality of the show, which is great throughout, goes to another level. So I'm more forgiving of this sort of mystery when it's executed so well. Let's go back to that cake. So I mentioned that the cake now has 3 candles. In episode 1, they called it his anniversary. So that would imply that each time we're seeing Adrian Veidt, although it feels like it could be taking place a day later, perhaps it's taking place a year later. This feels very, without spoiling anything, Westworld-esque. That's another show that played with time a little bit. It showed scenes where you weren't quite sure when they took place or where they took place. I think that's what's happening here. I think we're going to find out that time is passing differently than we expect in these scenes. Like I said, perhaps each time we've seen him, each episode, a year has gone by. So, theories. What is going on here? So a little bit of light is shed here. We hear him called a captive. So this is the first time the idea has been introduced that Adrian Veidt is not here willingly. Who is holding him captive? The obvious guess would be Dr. Manhattan. We mentioned that time seems to be passing in a strange way. There's a bunch of clones running around. This whole place feels kind of otherworldly. And in episode 1, for a moment, we see Dr. Manhattan on TV in a news broadcast on Mars, and he appears to have constructed a structure which looks very similar to the castle which Adrian Veidt is staying in. So, like I said, obvious guess is that Dr. Manhattan is holding him captive. Why is he doing that? It's not exactly clear, but did Dr. Manhattan conjure up some world to contain Adrian Veidt? Did he populate it with clones? And if he populated that place with clones, who was the guy on the horse? I think it's no mistake that the game warden had his face obscured by a mask. And here's a crazy theory. Maybe the guy on the horse, we know we have clones here, maybe the guy on the horse is also Adrian Veidt. And that also opens up the possibility that the world believes Adrian Veidt is dead. Maybe he is dead. Maybe the guy we're looking at is a clone. To what end? Who knows? And what was he doing with the guy in the suit? The fact that the guy had a rope tied to him implies that he wants to send him somewhere but be able to bring him back. The fact that we know Adrian Veidt is a captive makes me wonder if there's some boundary, and perhaps he tried sending Mr. Phillips across that boundary, and he came back frozen. And I believe that when you go to space and you're not properly suited up, you freeze. So is Adrian Veidt in space? Is he in a bubble that has an Earth-like atmosphere which allows him to live? Did Dr. Manhattan conjure up a dome, essentially, on Mars for Adrian Veidt to live in? I don't know, but that is my theory. A couple other things I'll say about this scene. It is very cool to see Adrian Veidt in his old Ozymandias suit again. I like that this episode is starting to embrace the concept of the costumed vigilante. I was starting to miss that a little bit in the first 2 episodes. So here we had Mr. Shadow. We have the Silk Spectre, even though she didn't suit up. And now we have Ozymandias in his suit. My one criticism of this scene is they really built up the reveal that this guy's Adrian Veidt. The camera pans up, the music swells, and he says, "Signed, Adrian Veidt." Like it's this big reveal, like we didn't all see it coming. So the fact that it just felt so obvious that this guy's Adrian Veidt, the fact that they built it up to be this big reveal, felt kind of lame to me and didn't work that well in a sequence that otherwise I thought was awesome. From there, we go back to Laurie in that blue phone booth. And if you recall, where did we leave off with her joke? She said that a little girl threw a brick as high in the air as she could. Forgot the joke, told a new one about 3 heroes, go to God, make their case, they all get sent to hell. What happens next? God's all alone, the 3 heroes are in hell. Oh, remember that brick from earlier? Lands on God's head and kills him, and God goes to hell. Then Laurie says, roll on snare drum, curtain, good joke. So that is a quote, or a slightly different version of a quote, from Rorschach, which we'll come back to that in a second. Basically, after telling the joke, Laurie gets very upset. So she, like I said a few times, has been very calm, collected, very closed off this whole episode. So when she starts to get emotional here, when she starts to get frustrated at the fact that Dr. Manhattan has abandoned Earth, has abandoned her, she says to him, and again, I'm going to curse, but when I quote, it's okay to curse. She says, the assholes down here still think you give a shit. even though you've been living on another fucking planet for 30 years. But we're not really worth giving a shit about anyway, are we? Then she says, "Good night, John." So that scene was probably the moment in this episode, maybe of the entire series, that worked the best for me. Because although I've found this series intriguing, interesting, mysterious, very well made, it hasn't had a really good emotional gut punch for me yet. But here, when Laurie starts to cry, after having it all pulled together so well this episode, that hit me hard. She walks out of the phone booth, and then a car falls out of the sky and lands in front of her. It appears to be the same car that Will was sitting in the last episode, the one that got picked up by that magnet hanging from that mysterious airship. Then Laurie starts to laugh, presumably because she just told a joke about a brick falling from the sky, and now a car fell from the sky, as though Dr. Manhattan is answering her prayers. So a few things to say about this scene. Number one, Laurie's quote, "Roll on snare drum, curtain, good joke." That is a slightly different ordered quote from something that Rorschach said. So this is a direct quote from the Watchmen graphic novel. And when you're quoting Rorschach, you've got to do it in the Rorschach voice. And to do that, I'm going to have a little bit of water because he has a very gravelly voice. Right, Alon?
Exactly.
So Rorschach says in his journal, "I heard joke once. Man goes to doctor. Says he's depressed. Life seems harsh and cruel. Says he feels all alone in threatening world. Doctor says, treatment is simple. The great clown, Pagliacci, is in town. Go see him. That should pick you up. Man bursts into tears. But doctor, he says, I am Pagliacci. Good joke. Everybody laugh. Roll on snare drum. Curtains." So very similar to what Laurie said there. Then I also want to say a lot of people have a theory that the car was actually dropped by Dr. Manhattan. That doesn't feel right to me. It feels a little bit too obvious. And if Dr. Manhattan were going to send Laurie some kind of a sign, why would he do it specifically by dropping Will's car, which we know is picked up by that mysterious airship last episode? And I don't think Dr. Manhattan was behind that, because if Dr. Manhattan wanted to pick up a car and move it, he could just snap his fingers. He wouldn't need an airship to do it. So I'm reading this as pure coincidence and just meant to be a funny way for that car to rematerialize and a funny note to end the episode on. I also want to point out that the last couple of episodes have gone out of their way a few times to mention that Dr. Manhattan has a lot of abilities, but he doesn't have the ability to look like us. They seem to want to make that very clear, almost like they want us to believe that. So later on, there's a twist where Dr. Manhattan truly is one of these characters. Maybe he can actually look like us, and he's hiding among us. The obvious guess at who that could be would be Will, the man in the wheelchair. I don't think that's the case because they've dropped a few hints already that Will might be another character. Forget his name, I think Hooded Justice, but basically one of the first masked adventurers, the man who dresses up in the hood and has the rope hanging from his neck. So if Dr. Manhattan is among us, I don't think it's going to be Will. Overall, really enjoyed episode 3. It was a good change of pace to get out of Tulsa, get some new characters. I think Laurie is a great addition to this show. I hope that these episodes, now that Laurie is in Tulsa, I hope the episodes start to intermingle Laurie and Angela. I don't want it to be like it's been, where first 2 episodes focus on Angela, the next one focuses on Laurie. It'll be nice if we can get both of them together in every episode because I enjoy both of the characters so much and I enjoyed them interacting with each other. Anyway, I think episode 4 is going to be coming out in about 15 minutes. So with that, we can probably wrap it up. Can't wait for tonight's episode. Things I'm hoping to see. One, I want to see more Laurie, like I said. I want to see more Adrian Veidt. I want to see more Looking Glass. I hope that the mystery around Adrian Veidt doesn't start to get stale. When you have a show that asks a lot of questions and doesn't give a lot of answers, that can get old fast, like we've seen with the show Lost, which Damon Lindelof was heavily involved in, and he's also involved and runs the show Watchmen, so I'm constantly sort of worried about that. Drew in the chat room says, I think they'll start to mix them, just have to introduce all the players. I agree with you there. There's been a lot of characters in this show, and even if you're familiar with the graphic novel and you know the character Laurie, so much time has passed. I'm glad the show is taking its time to fill us in on how she's doing. And we have new characters like Angela. We need time to get to know them. Now that both of those characters are pretty well established, like Drew in the chat says, I think they'll start to mix them, and that's what I'm hoping to see. I'm also hoping for another glimpse at Dr. Manhattan. One of the things that I'm sorely missing from this show that was present in the graphic novel is the graphic novel dealt very heavily with political questions. And this show is doing the same thing. In the graphic novel, it was challenging the idea of fascism, vigilantes, who watches the Watchmen. It focused a lot on the doomsday clock, the Cold War, but there was another piece to it. It also got very deeply philosophical, looking at the nature of time through the lens of Dr. Manhattan. And there were some pretty trippy chapters in that graphic novel. I would love for there to be an entire episode that focuses on Dr. Manhattan. If anybody viewing this watched Twin Peaks: The Return, there was an episode, I believe it was episode 8, which was about 45 minutes of just cosmic, beautiful nonsense. I would love for there to be an episode like that in this show, focusing on Dr. Manhattan. I don't think we'll get it, but I would just love for them to bring in an element of that meditation on the nature of reality, the nature of time. The political stuff is great. That stuff is interesting. But those deeper philosophical questions appealed to me more when I read the original graphic novel. So if we can get a little bit more of that here, that would be awesome. I'm also just a sci-fi nerd, so seeing those sci-fi elements like Dr. Manhattan, like whatever the hell is going on with Adrian Veidt, that stuff works really well for me, and I want to see more of it. So fingers crossed we see more of it tonight. And with that, I think we can wrap it up. If you're watching this live, know that I will be back on at 10:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for a quick reaction to tonight's episode. Won't be a full recap like this one. I'll take a few days to digest the episode, give you my unfiltered thoughts tonight, come back later with the full recap and this deeper analysis. Anyway, if you enjoyed this live stream, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and you've got to hit that little bell icon to make sure you get notifications whenever we do more videos like this one. You're especially going to want to do that because we're doing many more of these live streams. We've had a couple of great ones where people get involved in the discussion, they get involved in the conversation. That could be you if you subscribe and hit the bell icon. Anyway, thanks for watching.